therefore, when it comes to real change that might bring about real freedom from oppression, we prefer the demon that we know rather than the uncertainty of the future we do not know. In other words, we prefer our bondage to the status quo. The final point is that unless we trust in the power of God to transform, and unless we act upon that trust and proceed with the confidence that God is with us and God will provide a way where there is no way, we will remain in our bondage. Let me provide for you a couple of classic examples. A woman suffering from domestic violence and abuse continues to live with her abuser because she is afraid of saying no. Enough. And of seeking out the help that will stop the abuse. And because she is afraid, the abuse goes on and on and on. A child being sexually molested by a parent or a family member or a friend is frightened about the consequences of what might happen if she speaks out truthfully. Usually because the abuser has planted those seeds of fear in the child. If you tell, your daddy will go to jail. What child can possibly stand up to that fear of sending her own parents to jail? And so she remains silent, and the abuse goes on and on and on. A family has become codependent with an alcoholic in their midst because they are afraid of the consequences of standing up to the alcoholic, and so they go on covering up, they go on making excuses for the behavior, and they go on living in bondage. Or the alcoholic or drug addict that is afraid of life without their drug of choice. They fear letting go of it. And even knowing that it is destroying their lives, they continue in that bondage because the devil you know is always more comfortable than the devil you don't know. Now, I want to be clear in those examples. I'm not blaming the victim for their inaction. I am describing their bondage. I am describing the chains that keep them bound to that evil, that prevents them from crying out and getting the help that they need. And we all look at those examples and we shake our heads and we ask ourselves, well, why don't they just speak up and end it all? Why don't they just break the chains and get out from underneath that bondage? Oh, that it would be so easy to do. But before we go too far down that road of condemnation, and consider them to be somehow defective, that they choose to continue on in living in that bondage, let's take a look inside. Remember how I began this sermon? I said that the man who was in bondage represented the whole community. It was not just the man who Jesus exorcised the demon from who was in bondage. His whole community is in bondage. He is nothing more than a symbol for the whole. That truth is revealed in the fact that once one was cured in their midst, they wanted him out of there as quickly as possible. In other words, they preferred the demon of Roman occupation over the prospect of Rome's violent reprisal on those who sought to challenge them. A reprisal that they know only too well from the scorched earth policy of putting down the rebellion at Sepphoris less than 30 years before. And so they remain in bondage. Now, don't misunderstand me. Jesus is not calling for armed resistance against Rome. But what he is calling for is a non-violent resistance in the form of non-cooperation with Rome and Rome's policies. And he is clearly saying that it is the fear of death which paralyzes life and keeps one in bondage. I want to return